Tantra Illuminated with Dr. Christopher Wallace is a journey through the depths of the human experience, as viewed through the lens of the tradition called non-dual Shaiva Tantra. This multi-format podcast delves into the fascinating world of classical Tantra and its intersections with philosophy, neuroscience, psychology, human development, and the broader world of spirituality. In this episode, I'm speaking with Judith Blackstone, an innovative, experienced teacher in the contemporary fields of non-dual realization and spiritual, relational, and somatic psychotherapy. She has 35 years of clinical experience as a psychotherapist and 35 years of experience practicing in various non-dual traditions such as Advaita Vedanta, Kashmir Shaivism, Mahamudra, and Dzogchen. She developed the realization process, a non-sectarian, non-religious, non-denominational, direct path for realizing fundamental non-dual consciousness, as well as the application of that realization for psychological, relational, and physical healing. She's published 7 books, such as The Fullness of the Ground, A Guide to Embodied Awakening, Trauma and the Unbound Body, The Healing Power of Fundamental Consciousness, Belonging Here, A Guide for the Spiritually Sensitive Person, and several more. Judith has a profoundly practical approach to the spiritual path, unbound by any dogmas or doctrines. And we have an interesting conversation where we don't quite agree on everything, but we do agree on a lot. And she brings a very valuable perspective, and I think is especially worth investigating for those who want teachings that are purely practical as opposed to doctrinal. So I bring you Judith Blackstone. Enjoy. I'm here with Judith Blackstone. Welcome, Judith.
Thank you. Thank you, Harish.
Nice to be with you. And I would love if you could start with a little recounting of your journey, like how it started, how you initially got interested in these subjects, and what were some of the pivotal discoveries on your path that led you towards what you now teach.
Okay. That's a tremendous long would be a tremendous long story for me to relate to you. The real beginning, I guess, was when I injured my back in my mid-20s, good 50 years ago. And I had been a professional dancer since I was 9. So rather unusual childhood and very dedicated to my life as a dancer. And then I injured my back, wasn't able to do it anymore. So of course, I thought life was over, and went to various body workers and healers, and unfortunately also to medical profession, where they fused my back in the off balance in the injured position. And then I was lost. I lay on the floor of my loft, my dance studio where I lived, and basically just prayed for help. And I began to notice very interesting things that I had never known about before. I noticed that when I really surrendered my weight to the floor, energetic movement came up through me, through my body, and actually pulled me into alignment. And various things like that began to draw me away from my despair and made me very curious about a more subtle kind of attunement that we can have to ourselves. At the same time, people were coming to my loft to take dancing lessons because that's how I made a living. And so I began to teach them these subtle attunements that I was exploring. And that was the beginning of what is now called the realization process. Of course, it's come a long way since then, but it began with those subtle attunements. And I trained as a body worker. I trained as a psychotherapist and was in private practice for about 40 years. And I lived at a Zen monastery where I finally, in 1981, for a little over a year, where I finally realized that this kind of numinous presence that I had always, really always kind of discerned in the air, even as a child in my extremely atheistic home, was actually something that could be experienced pervading everywhere. And that was, of course, a major turning point, and became a realization that was the main teaching, right, the main theme of the realization process. I now teach ways to attune directly to that pervasive consciousness. I call it fundamental consciousness in the realization process, but as you know, it has many names in the spiritual literature. Undivided, very subtle ground of consciousness that can be unveiled within our body and within our environment, and is actually, and this is where perhaps my teaching does kind of deviate from a lot of the traditional teachings, can be experienced pervading our own body as the ground of our individual being and the basis of our individual healing and maturity at the same time, in exactly the same way that it gives us a sense of self-other oneness pervading our body and environment. So that became the realization process, just practices that seemed to arise fairly spontaneously for my own healing and for the healing and awakening of the people who came to work with me.
Beautiful. Yeah, that's very interesting. So, uh, there's a teaching in the tradition that I study about three stages of awakening, and I wonder how it relates to your experience. Because in this teaching, the first stage is realization of your essence, of your soul, if you will, using that term very loosely, realizing that you, in fact, are this perfectly whole, radiant nothingness, rather than this psyche, this body, this person, um, but that radiant nothingness is the, as you say, the inner ground, the ground of our being, that doesn't in any way invalidate the experience of personhood, but deeply transcends it. And then in the second stage, it's realization of oneness, of unity consciousness, that there's an undivided field of energy, and that what you had taken to be a separate self is not separate. It's part of that undivided field of energy. And then in the third stage, it's realizing the formless ground of everything, the absolute, the void, or the great void. Um, and for many people, that third stage, in a way, partially negates the first stage, because me, the sense of me, vanishes, at least temporarily, in that third stage. So I don't know if any of this, how much this intersects with
Well,
your
I,
own experience.
of course, I meet with it, and I also disagree with it in several places. I, I'm in my experience, Atma equals Brahman. They're the same. So, and that's right from the get-go. So I don't divide it into stages. Um, I think in some way I'm going right to that last stage. At least in my own experience, I know of nothing beyond that. So So I'm teaching that direct attunement to this pervasive luminosity pervading inside and outside at the same time. Now, I make a distinction in the realization process between fundamental consciousness, which is experienced as stillness, and energy, what you might call spanda, right? They arise at the same time, and yet we can be attuned. This is my view, right? We can be attuned to this kind of streaming, pulsing uh, dimension of energy without getting to the underlying stillness. So we go right to the stillness with the understanding and the experience that there will be a bit of radiance that also emerges at the same time. So anyway, I don't call it energy, I call it fundamental consciousness, and we attune to it as pervasive stillness, slightly luminous stillness. I also, and here I think and this I actually consider how I differ from a lot of traditional teachings. Maybe I don't know, maybe all of the traditional teachings. Although it was interesting to me that you said temporarily, that it temporarily erases that sense of I. So that was kind of interesting to me because I don't feel that it does. And I feel like a lot of the traditional teachings, as they've come down to us and as we've possibly even misinterpreted them, tends to encourage people to erase the sense of their own existence. And so I have students coming to me who are sort of dulling their eyes, trying not to feel, trying not to reflect on their experience, um, just just frankly trying not to exist. And yet I've found quite a lot, even in the spiritual literature, that back this up. That sense of I am, I am, uh, actually becomes clearer, comes to the fore. Um, I had an Indian teacher who used to say, Harish says, I am Harish, Judith says, I am Judith, but it's the same I in all of us. And, and I grasped onto that because that's my experience. And it was very important for me because growing up psychologically, uh, I was only too happy to erase myself. I did erase myself. So to get to that sense of, yes, I, as much an I as all the other I's, perhaps it's the same I. That's a metaphysical question that I can't answer. Perhaps it's the same I. Certainly, it resonates with all the other I's. But for each of us, I feel it really feels like it feels like who we actually are, who I most personally am. So I don't consider it an impersonal state. I consider it the most personal state. So I'm not sure I'm really saying something different, or I'm just saying in a different way that I feel is maybe less, that sometimes the way it's put out there can be misleading to people.
Yeah, I think we don't actually disagree uh, very much, but as you know, words words
Yeah,
can get in the way of meaning when it comes to the most subtle topics, you
right.
know.
Yes.
Um, so I absolutely agree that it's generally a bad idea to encourage anyone to erase themselves, um, or to imply that that should be done. Rather, I would say that for some people in this process, there comes a point where there's a falling away of the self, and that can be permanent or it can be temporary, but it happens of its own accord if it happens at all. And to try to make that happen or to try to erase yourself is indeed, in a sense, pathological and not to be encouraged at all. But I would like to make a distinction between the sort of psychological self, the self concept, and the pure I am.
That's what's important here. That's
Yeah.
what's important. I mean, whenever someone says the self does not exist, I'm like, well, what do you mean by self? Yeah, the constructions fall away. The attitudes and I am a teacher, I'm a good person, I'm a bad person, fall away. Um, and even the experience of what Trungpa Rinpoche used to call rawness and suchness of life, emerges. You get that kind of direct experience, but you can also reflect on the experience. You can even dislike the experience without interfering with that deep realization. So, so you're still there, Um, so you're still there, whatever that you means, or whatever that there means. There you are.
Yeah, but I gather from what I've read of your work that you experience the self as non-separate, right? That there can be an I am, a pure I am, but it's not separable from the greater whole. Is that right?
And yet it's not the greater whole. I mean, the space pervades and reveals each of us, um, in our separateness. I think for a lot of people, it's very important to feel connected. For me, it was very important to feel separate. and and so and so I'm teaching my path, but I find that merging that can happen when we say, oh well, it's all one, we're all one, um, misses the actual underlying resonance of my separate self with your separate self, my separate being, if you prefer, with your separate being. So so I don't know. I mean, we may be saying exactly the same thing, and probably we are. Experientially, it's just the way the teaching is presented, and yeah, it's just the way it's presented, I think.
And why do you say it was important for you to feel separate? In what sense did you mean that?
Because I used to merge with everything that I experienced and every person that I was with, and I would interact with someone, come home, not know, not have any inward contact with myself. Right, I would lose inward contact with myself. That's one thing about the energetic dimension, right? Which is where I lived, as a young person, as energy that we can all merge together as energy, but as clear space, as fundamental consciousness, experienced as stillness pervading you and me. The two different beings are both whole within themselves and absolutely connected, completely indivisibly connected through that pervasive space. So that's how I've been teaching it. And my last book, I explore this very subject in depth of the fullness of the ground, and I did find things in the literature that help to support this view, which is sometimes, which is sometimes seems to be in conflict with the traditional teachings, but it's really not. I think it's really not. Just as you said, that it could be semantics, or it just could be what people emphasize in the experience of realization.
Yeah, it might be interesting to go a little bit deeper with this. So, speaking from my own experience as well as a traditional view, insofar as I understand it, it's hard for me to think of the individual as real in the sense that I don't find any boundary. I don't find any boundary that would circumscribe a so-called individual. I mean, there's certainly a unique perspective, a unique vantage point here, but since there's no boundary and no dividing line anywhere to be found, that makes the concept of individual, you know, somewhat meaningless to me. And this is in the zoom out, in the big picture zoom out. Of course, there's a mind operating, here, and so, and a body and so on. But there is no dividing line, like the mind is participating in a field of mind. The body is participating in the appearance of a physical universe, and everything is appearing within awareness without any separation or dividing line. So that's why I feel a little bit like, I don't know if there actually is a disagreement here, but I'm curious how you conceive
I mean,
individuality from the perspective of fundamental consciousness.
yeah. Well, I just think it's important that it reveals each of us in our distinctness. I mean, you can't see behind you. I can see the curtain behind you. I don't know if it's a curtain, but I can see the wall behind you, but you cannot. And and that makes a difference, and it gives us something to talk about too, right? Like I could say, well, where did you grow up? It's different from where I grew up. Uh, it brings a richness, but also it brings a resonance, like the separateness. Like if we were just, there was really no boundary between us, there wouldn't even be contact. And one of the things that happens when two people are more attuned to fundamental consciousness together, the love inside one person's chest actually resonates with the love inside another person's chest, right? The power, the feeling of power within our belly, which is a felt experience, resonates with that feeling within the belly of another. So it's that kind of relating across distance, that sort of experiencing that you're one with someone else without losing inward contact with yourself, that I have found very valuable, and that the people who come to me to learn from me also seem to feel is valuable. That there is a boundary. It the difference in vantage point is not just you said this is like a zoom out, but I don't believe in zooming in and out. I just like one, like what is it? How is it? Uh, we don't have to zoom in and out. Uh, it's just how do we understand this when we've both realized that ground of our being. So that's where I am on it. But it's a little different. But I think it's more different in the presentation. In the realization process, I actually teach relational practices so that people can experience that they're both separate and one at the same time, and that there's a resonance between them. The innermost core of ourselves that I work with quite a bit, Sushumna, which actually puts me, aside from the non-duality field in some ways. They don't believe in working with that, and yet when we get to that innermost core of ourselves, we can, for one thing, enter into fundamental consciousness much more easily than without that inward attunement. But we can actually experience the resonance of chakra to chakra across distance. So again, here's my, you know, hopefully we're each teaching our own true path, right? We're each teaching what we actually learned, what we needed, and then what we actually learned. So
Yeah.
that's what I needed, and that's what I learned.
Yeah, and just a little thing there, which is you said it sets you apart from people in the non-duality field, but there you're referring to Advaita Vedanta, or rather Neo Advaita, right? Because in tantric non-duality, the practice of working with the central channel is, well, central. It is
Yes,
it is absolutely key. So it doesn't set you apart from tantric, or as it's called, Kashmir Shaivism type of non-duality.
I understand that. I It's just that even in the last few months, I've been told a couple of times that what I'm doing is tantra and not non-duality. People, I I don't care. I don't care. You know
Yeah, yeah.
what box.
So, but it's interesting that you talked about boundary as a point of communion, because, and maybe this is just language, but because I would say it's exactly the lack of boundary that allows for the communion of of the love energy in this chest with the love energy in your chest, and so on. That it's because reality is undivided that that communion can take place. But if you're conceiving of boundary as a meeting point rather than a dividing line, then perhaps we're saying the same thing.
I'm not. I'm thinking of boundary as the container of my being, right? Like fundamental consciousness pervading me and the desk reveals very clearly where I stop and the desk begins. Pervading me and you reveals really clearly where I end and you begin. So I think you're using the word barrier. A barrier is a protective boundary, but I think that there's actually a true boundary, and that maybe that's where we actually differ. But I think
Yeah.
there's a true boundary that is permeable, that is pervaded, and in fact, because we need to. Here's another thing, because we need to let go into this oneness from deep within our whole being. That inner contact with our whole individual being, I think, is really important. A lot of teachers now are saying, "Oh, just let go. This is your true nature. Just let go. You'll be there." Um, that would be great if it were true. I don't think it is. Most people will then let go from the surface of themselves, and then the self-other oneness, the transcendence, actually doesn't occur. Um, so, so I think that's what it is. I'm not talking about barrier, and I'm
Hmm.
not talking about the protective boundary that we each grow up creating to protect ourselves or to keep ourselves from being overwhelmed. But I do think there's me and there's you.
Yeah, that okay, so that is an interesting difference because when I experience fundamental consciousness, I experience a total continuity. I don't experience a point where I end and the desk begins, or I end and of course there are visual differences, but I experience a complete continuity of consciousness, that consciousness is appearing as this body, and the same consciousness is equally appearing as the table, um, and a kind of seamless continuity, between the two, or everywhere really.
But pervading the two, not just between the two,
Yeah, pervading, absolutely correct.
pervading. So in pervading, wood, really different than flesh. Um, I don't know. So anyway, uh, I also experience it as seamless, undivided, absolutely pervading everything. Um, I don't think that you and I are the same. And like once I sat with someone after I was giving some kind of presentation somewhere, and they said, "Oh, we're the same being." Well, no, we're not the same being. That would be so boring. Now, I have to say that in part of my path, I focused very much on our all being faces of one being, and that helped me to relate with other people. But
Exactly. Okay, so here, this is an interesting point of agreement because Vedanta and Neo Advaita, they say what you just said, like, oh, there's no difference, right? That's an important, distinction between Vedanta and Tantra, because in Tantra we say, no, there is difference. It's one consciousness wearing different bodies that have different minds, that have different experiences, but it's one consciousness experiencing through these different
yeah,
bodies and
but
minds.
that's an idea. I mean, that's a way of talk. That's a metaphysical idea, which is a beautiful idea. But you know, it's like, is there a central? There's no central being who's doing that, right? There's no central being that's talking out of all of us. Um, I don't think. I don't think. So anyway, it's just a matter of the way the work is presented. I haven't found that a helpful presentation for myself or for the people who come to work with me. So I present it like this. I mean, it's pretty much saying the same thing. Uh, you know, we're each pervaded by the same space. We each experience it as our own individual ground, as well as continuous, seamlessly with the world around us and with each other. We relate to each other across the distance of the room, across the distance of our different vantage points, across spatial distance. Energetically, I grew up in a home where at least the women in the family all merged together. That was love, right? We mushed together. That was love. And it it might have been love, but you could never really see each other. I felt loved but not known. In an interesting
Mm.
way. Uh, so I teach it from this different angle, and I have found it that it's helpful. I found it was helpful for myself, so I'm presenting it that way. Uh, it's the one consciousness of which we're each a face of or a shape of is a metaphysical idea. And this is the idea that I learned in my years on the ashram. It's a metaphysical idea, and it's a beautiful idea, but it's just a way of putting it.
Yeah. I mean, for some, including me, it's possible to have this intuitive sense when gazing into the eyes of another that what's gazing back is fundamentally the same, though seeing through a different body mind, which of course shapes experience, but that
Shapes it
which
quite a
is
lot.
seeing, and that's just an intuition. Of course, you're absolutely right that it's not provable. We can't demonstrate even through direct experience. We can only have an intuition about it or not.
I think the ground pervades us both. Now, in terms of us gazing into each other's eyes and feeling that what is looking back, to me, that's kind of a protective stance. Oh, I'm looking into your eyes. What's looking back at me is exactly like myself. That's a lot less scary than what's looking back at me is not exactly like myself. Has all kinds of different templates, different judgments. You know, so
That's an
not
interesting
exactly like
point.
myself. Basically, fundamentally, yes, yes, it pervades us both. But in our communication, the differences are quite important.
Yeah, and a very important point that we certainly agree on is that a lot of people, maybe even the majority in some spaces, are using spirituality to transcend, read, bypass their humanity, and that your work and tantra both emphasize that is not the path. That the path is embracing intimacy with what is. And of course, there is a transcendent aspect of our being, which we're calling the ground here.
Right.
But that seeking to rise above any aspect of your humanity is in a way seeking to escape. It's an escapism, you know.
And a diminishment of pleasure, the enjoyment of being human, of touch and emotion and understand cognition, the pleasure of being human.
Of course, some people need to kind of go through and experience the pain hidden in their bodies before they can fully access the pleasure of being human.
Absolutely. And that's where it becomes a psychological path as well, kind of intertwined, almost inseparable from the spiritual path. Uh, I think it is. I think, you know, in in the realization process, we start with inhabiting the body. We open to fundamental consciousness by contacting and letting go from within our whole body. One very interesting thing is that everywhere that we are in contact or inhabiting or living within our body, we're also disentangled from it. We've also that's also a lack of grip, which is just an interesting thing. So everywhere that we inhabit our body, we can let go of ourselves into fundamental consciousness. Now we can't let go of our body where we have intensely protected ourselves psychologically, where we're holding pain in our body. So, uh, so that process of letting go of those limitations, those constrictions, those places that we don't have contact, along with the beliefs and strategies, behavioral strategies that go along with the memories that are held in those places in the body, that's an inseparable process from the letting go, from the attunement to fundamental consciousness. Fundamental consciousness, you know, in order to really enter into it, you need very gradually, and this is also maybe a difference in my work with some of the ways it's being taught. It's not just like, and now you're in the ground. Uh, for me, there is a difference. There is a moment of entering into that ground and stabilizing there, but then you can continue to open to it by more fully inhabiting the body and letting go more fully from within the body. So, so psychological work is very much part of what I'm doing. Oops, you
Yeah,
froze.
this is very interesting because it's a very somatic psychological work,
That's right.
which I think is considerably more effective than psychological work that's not somatic.
I
Uh,
think so too.
and coming back to something you said, um, is it sufficient to I mean, absolutely inhabiting the body fully is such a crucial part of this process, and finding that, oh, there can be resistance to inhabiting the body fully because of the pain that's hidden. Of course, there's also sometimes joy hidden there too that we also discover in this process, right? But the pain is what inhibits the inhabiting, and is simply inhabiting the body fully with awareness sufficient for the letting go, the releasing of the constriction and the gripping and the clinging, or the pushing, or is something else needed for that?
Yeah, yes, the inhabiting of the body is not enough in itself. We need also to enter in through the innermost core of the body, Shushumna, um, in order to inhabit the body is that most subtle dimension of ourselves. So we're letting go from within that core, and yeah, as well as from within the body. So we're attuning to that extreme subtle level of ourselves. Yeah.
Okay, okay. So this is very interesting because this is again where tantra would agree that somatic psychology by itself is insufficient for realization of our true nature, because something mysterious and alchemical happens when awareness penetrates to that innermost core
Yeah.
that we call sushumna, um, or the central channel.
Right.
And that's beautiful. So those two together, inhabiting the body fully with awareness and accessing, however, um, subtly, the central channel, those two together are both necessary and sufficient for this letting go of what needs to be released in order to experience our wholeness. Is that right?
Yes, that seems to be the case. Uh, we also attune to. I mean, we there's a bit more to it in the realization process. We attune to qualities of fundamental consciousness in order to open to it through our whole body and through the whole of the innermost core of ourselves. Because I've found that people who have meditated in for many years without doing that will meditate where they're already most open, where they live. they'll meditate in their heart if they're kind of oriented through their heart, if they'll meditate in their head, if that's where they mostly live. Um, and even some spiritual traditions will emphasize heart or head, or even the lower body. Um, so so we also attune to these experience. I can't say they exist, but we can experience very, very subtle quality with within that ground, right? Um, I'm not alone in that. Tibetan Buddhism assigns qualities to it. Uh, Brahman has Satchitananda, attributed to it as, I haven't often heard that talked about as palpable as experiential qualities, more as a metaphysical designation. But Tibetan Buddhism definitely, says it can be experienced as emptiness, clarity, and bliss. And we attune to it in the realization process as awareness, emotion, and physical sensation, meaning the unchanging ground of awareness, emotion, and physical sensation, and awareness not as a function, but as a quality, as an experiential quality pervading everywhere, right? So emotion pervading everywhere, or love pervading, physical sensation even pervading everywhere. So we also do that in order to in order to move along, in order to further that opening into.
Yeah. Okay. So this is very interesting because, yeah, opposed to some of the Vedantins who say, "Oh, it's completely qualityless or transcends all qualities. It's nirguna."
Right.
In Tantra, we say no. Fundamental consciousness has qualities. They might be very subtle, and curiously, they can be very strong and very subtle at the same time.
Mhm.
um, but this capacity for reverence, which is to say love, a kind of love, um, seems to be inherent in fundamental consciousness. A capacity for clarity, for joy, it seems to be inherent, and not added. you know so that's important because it means we can all access that. These are universal
Yes,
qualities, not just some people.
that's right. That's right. That's the I that's in all of us. Yeah.
And so, do you teach three primary centers: head, heart, and belly?
I do actually, but I do that just for convenience sake. And when people, work with me a while, eventually we get to a lot of the chakras, even the ones above the head. Um, but I have two main practices. Two main practices. One is attuning to just three centers along that core.
And those three centers have the qualities of awareness and energy and sensation, respectively, or how would you phrase it?
Not consciousness energy, no, but rather awareness, the ground of emotion or love, and the ground of physical sensation, all as stillnesses, all as aspects of the stillness, not energy, except for the vibrance that emerges with it. Um, so, and I don't actually the core points. I don't correlate with those three, although they can be, of course, correlated with them. But we attune to awareness way above our head. We attune, and within our head, we attune to emotion. The mid third of the body, we attune to physical sensation, the lower part of the body, and then feeling it in the whole body, each of them, and then pervading everywhere. It's very interesting to experience physical sensation as a ground, an unmodified, seamless ground, pervading everywhere. It's the tactile aspect of fundamental consciousness. So to answer your question, I actually don't use the core points in that way, the three core points.
Yeah,
But I
but
can.
it is an interesting correspondence to me because you didn't, you came up with this through your own process. You didn't learn it from tantra, but the same teaching is in tantra of that awareness is all pervasive, but at the same time primarily associated with the head center. That what we can call love is all pervasive, but primarily associated with the heart center. And embodiment or physicality or substance is everywhere, but primarily associated with the belly. And that these are kind of like entry points or access points to these three aspects of the unified field, even though they're all pervasive. That's a kind of interesting mystery there.
Yes. Yes. The only one that's a little different is that last one, where I'm not talking about physical sensation as embodiment or physicality or form. I'm talking about it as one of the textures of fundamental consciousness, tactile texture. There are the three bodies also in Tibetan Buddhism that are, but also more kind of metaphysical kind of ideas than the experiences. Right. And again, it's, Dharmakaya, oh God, am I going to remember the names? Probably not. But,
Yeah,
but
yeah, Nirmanakaya, Sambhogakaya. Yeah.
that's right. That's right. So form, you know, desire, emptiness. Yeah.
But I think you're making a great point, which is that people encounter these teachings as metaphysical constructs, but they can very much be textures of immediate experience.
Yes.
Uh,
Yes.
yeah,
That's
and
right.
that's exactly what we're missing if we're doing a transcendentalist meditation,
Right.
seeking to go up and out. We're
Right.
missing these wonderful textures of experience that
Yes.
are, in a way, as you say, inherent in consciousness. Like, even though embodiment doesn't, or the texture of physicality doesn't seem to be logically inherent in consciousness, and yet it is, because consciousness is always embodied.
Yes. Well, but yes, but even pervading everywhere. Yes,
Yeah,
absolutely. Pervades the space, that tactile aspect. So so it's, it is the basic essence of our humanness and maybe possibly of everything, of all life. But yeah, so there's that part of it. Yeah. Yeah, I came to it out of necessity, but I was amazed and very gratified to find that these things had been written about and experienced for thousands of years. It was a really very affirming.
yeah. And the fundamental practice that you teach is, in a way, very similar to a tantric practice, where in this tantric practice called nyasa, you focus on each body part one at a time. And in the tantric version, you install a mantra, a mantric syllable in each body part. And but in your practice, it's similar in the sense that you're cultivating the sense of awareness alive and inhabiting each body
Yeah,
part one at a time. But it is a kind of methodical nyasa process of working through the whole body.
that's right. One at a time and then as a whole.
Exactly.
And then, but being there, being there. Yeah.
Reposing there. Yeah.
Yeah. Living, knowing oneself as being there.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and in fact, some people have done a kind of training where they do methodical attention to body parts, but in a way it can be quite dualistic. Like, some people who've done a lot of vipassana, they're focusing on each body part, but in a kind of subject object divided
Yeah.
way.
Yeah.
And
Very
and what I
different.
love about your teaching is that it's not that. It's actually feeling what you are in each body part.
Yes, that's right. That's right. Yeah, it's quite different. And one of the hardest transitions for some of my students have been from Vipassana to realization process to this more we call Shentang kind of experience. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, that's very interesting. And then to experience the whole body all at once as a whole, to me it kind of requires. going into soft focus. Because if we're used to focusing, if we've been trained to focus and concentrate, then it seems difficult to experience the whole body all at once. But by going into a kind of soft focus, like when you make your eyes go soft and see the whole visual field, it's like a soft focus of awareness. And then I can be with the whole body all at once as a whole.
It's
How would
not
you
a visual
characterize?
experience,
Yeah,
not a
not
visual.
visual. Yeah.
So we don't have to soften our visual focus at all. One of the things I teach uh, is how the senses, the use of the senses, is transformed when we know ourselves as fundamental consciousness. And I teach that right away before people have actually realized themselves as fundamental consciousness while they're still attuning to it as a volitional act, as a practice. I teach it right away. So, because otherwise we go back into that sort of dualistic use of the senses as soon as we open our eyes for meditation. So, so there is a part of the practice where we practice on what it's like to hear as fundamental consciousness, to see as fundamental consciousness, to see and hear at the same time, because the senses become unified as we become unified. Um, and it's not a softening of focus. It can be just very temporarily, but shouldn't be. Should be a kind of a actually clarifying a visual and all the audio auditory focus. Um, so, uh, and actually, this is mentioned in the Zen teaching. Dogen said to see and hear with the whole body and mind, and it's like that, like it's how we use the senses as a unity. Um, I have to make clear when I teach that I'm not teaching there there are sounds without a hearer, right? Which would be the oftentimes the traditional interpretation of that, right? Hearing is fundamental consciousness, that there's just sounds, there's nobody there to hear them. I'm not teaching that at all. I'm teaching that there you are hearing with everything that you've learned about what those sounds are and everything and so forth, but hearing in a disentangled and extremely receptive and global way, the whole field at once, as you said, um, hearing as fundamental consciousness. So that's an important part of the practice, just the way I feel like the relational work is an important part of the practice. Otherwise, as soon as we see or hear or relate to another person, we're back in that familiar divided place again. So so that's one reason I bring in the senses, changing the senses, and the relational practices right from the beginning. Yeah.
Yeah, I love what you're saying about seeing and hearing as fundamental consciousness. I totally agree that that's got to be a central practice in this process of realization. However it unfolds, that's going to be a part of it. And just to clarify, when I talked about soft focus, I just meant metaphorically. I just meant that as a metaphor. I should have maybe just said relaxing. It's like you've got to relax to a certain point while still being
Yes.
present in
Yes.
order to take in the whole field, because attention can be highly selective and
Right.
there's a relaxation needed to be with the whole field.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Wonderful. So your approach is very, very practical, which I
Yes.
love. You're not telling people what they should believe. You know,
Right.
that the view that you're teaching emerges from direct experience, of engaging with these practical methods.
Yes. I try very hard to keep it in the experiential uh, rather than making metaphysical statements. I attempt very, very hard to do that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Not to say anything that I don't know.
Yeah, and that is a beautiful kind of expression of humility and agnosticism that many spiritual teachers don't have, you know. Uh, and I think it's also, at the risk of sounding essentialist, it's also something to do with the feminine, meaning to say, whether it's cultural conditioning, it probably is, I see so many male spiritual teachers being like, this is the way and this is the truth. And more of the women teachers being, as you are, more experientially grounded and agnostic about anything that doesn't emerge from direct experience in this process.
I think it really, is heavily influenced by my being female, and for so many different reasons. One being that women are often not taken very seriously, when they do make statements. So having all my life had to really back up everything that I am saying with some practical foundation. So there's that. There is a gentleness to it, um, also. Yeah, coming out of the feminine, I'm sure. It's also that I didn't have like a one teacher. So I think a lot of teachers today are teaching what their teacher taught them. So they know it's true, right? Their teacher told them, and that person's teacher told that teacher. So then it comes down as, God's truth, that's it. And without the questioning, without the foundation. And so that was not the case for me. And then the last bit is that I grew up in an intensely, fanatically atheistic home,
Mm,
right? Where again, anything spiritual was just considered totally ridiculous. So so there's one reason I don't make metaphysical statements, or I try to avoid them. Not that easy. Try to avoid them, and just tell people this can be experienced. It's been described experientially for thousands of years, all over, at least all over Asia, and and here's how you might be able to experience it. That's it.
yeah, yeah. So coming back to the qualities of fundamental consciousness, um, like as you said in Vedanta, there's Satchidananda, which gets taught metaphysically rather than experientially, unfortunately. In your teaching, are the three qualities we already mentioned, we could say awareness, love, and sensation, are those the fundamental qualities in your experience that
We attune.
inhere within consciousness, fundamental consciousness, or are there more?
Well, I'm sure there are more. We attune to those because, again, practically, those help us open fully. And every once in a while, someone will ask me, "Can they substitute this word or that word?" I'm like, "Sure, if that's what works, sure." Um, I'm obviously just assigning words to experiences, right? So yeah, so call it what you will. Now, when we inhabit the body, we attune to qualities that also seem to be innate, seem to just be there, that are revealed when we know ourselves as this extremely subtle, undivided level of our embodiment. And so, again, more for helping one to inhabit the body more fully, we attune to those qualities, right? We attune to the quality of understanding in the brain, in the whole head, and which is interesting. We can experience that. Again, I'm just assigning a word to a quality. The reason I don't use intelligence is that when I ask people to attune to intelligence, they'll often come to their forehead, right? But to to awaken the internal contact, and fulfill the internal contact with the whole internal space of the head, the word understanding works better, right? So different parts of the torso, neck, and head are assigned different qualities. Again, they're just words, but interestingly, when we inhabit the body, those qualities do seem to emerge. A qualitative level of our internal experience of ourselves seems to emerge.
Yeah, and earlier you had a slight reaction to my use of the word energy, and I just want to clarify that in Tantra, anyway, energy refers to um, any activity of consciousness, such as emotion, and any activity, any excitation whatsoever, no matter how subtle, they call energy, they call Shakti, right? So emotion is energy, thought is energy. So it's a different. I think I use the word differently from how you do, perhaps. Um, and there's this teaching in the tantric tradition, of course, of the interdependence and ultimate unity of energy and formless stillness, right?
Right.
Shakti and Shiva, understood not as deities, but as flowing energy on the one hand and formless, silent stillness on the other,
Right.
and that they are intimately, pervading each other, and we can make this experiential distinction, but that they're ultimately a unity. What's your view on that, or
Yeah, absolutely. And in Tibetan Buddhism, the co-arising of phenomena and ground, or phenomena and primordial awareness, sure, absolute and the co-arising of absolute and relative. Um, we attune to this fundamental consciousness as stillness, and that which would be Shiva, right? But that freeze, because it pervades everywhere, it's a disentangled dimension. Otherwise, it wouldn't be seamless, right? It wouldn't go through everything seamlessly. So it's disentangled. So that means that it frees our experience of all of the content of experience. So I'm making a distinction between ground and content. Content moving, right? All of our experience moves, thoughts, emotions, right? So when we attune to the ground of emotion, we're not attuning to a specific emotion. We're attuning to the stillness within which specific emotions arise and dissipate. So that's the distinction I'm making between fundamental consciousness and the content of constantly changing content of experience.
yeah, and what I teach, which maybe is the same, is that we have to attune to the fundamental stillness before we can experience it pervading all the content. That's like a prerequisite. Like you don't, you can't, you have to feel into the depths of the silent stillness, and then you can experience it pervading all the content. Would you
Yeah,
agree?
sure, sure. We attune right to the stillness, and and then and then naturally thoughts move through it, emotions move through it, energy moves through it. So I do have people attune to themselves as matter, then to attune to themselves as energy, then to attune to themselves as fundamental consciousness, as stillness, and feeling how the stillness pervades and frees the energy, right?
Beautiful.
So yeah, so you have to attune, of course, to the stillness before they can experience both, and the experience of themselves as stillness and movement at the same time is where it's going. Stillness and movement at the same time. So you
Yeah.
look out the window, the leaves are, branches are moving in the wind without disturbing the stillness, without disturbing your attunement to the stillness pervading them.
Beautiful. Yeah, I teach the same thing. It's a contradiction to the mind, but it's a beautiful experience of movement not disturbing the
That's it.
all-pervasive stillness.
Exactly. We're teaching the same thing. Yeah.
Wonderful. Okay, so my last question is, would you say that love is at the root of all other emotions somehow, or not?
I, you know, that's a metaphysical question. What's at the root? Um, uh, we attune to the ground of emotion. And when people have difficulty experiencing that there's an emotional ground that's not any specific emotion, I'll have them attune to it as love. We actually attune to love as the quality that can be found within the chest.
Hmm.
Um, so, yeah, it's at the, it's, I mean, at the root you're making a causative, making a statement about causation.
Maybe, maybe.
Genesis.
What it more like? that other emotions are somehow maybe all related to love, like that desire is a function of love, that anger is a function of frustrated desire.
Uh,
It's more like not necessarily causative, but it's more like we can trace,
uh,
if we're attentive enough, trace down, and we find love or the longing for love at the root of other emotions. I'm not certain about this. It just seems to me to be true.
yeah, absolutely. My husband thinks that too. Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. So, yeah, it's definitely as deep as you can get. Love and the longing for love.
Maybe it's even better for your partner to think that than for you to think that. Well, it's wonderful to speak with you. I actually have another meeting that I had forgotten about, but this is a great
Yeah.
conversation already. A great whole.
It was fun. Yeah, it was a lot of fun. Yeah. Thank you,
Yeah.
Harish.
Well, thank you very much, and I'm very happy to be exposed to what you're teaching and sharing, and very happy that it's so non-dogmatic and free of unnecessary doctrine. We absolutely need teachers like you in the world.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. Well, take care, and
You
I'll
too.
talk to you
Yeah.
another time.
Yeah.
Hope you enjoyed the episode. Remember, you can always find out more about the tradition of non-dual Shaiva Tantra at tantrailluminated.org, where, if you wish, you can become a subscriber to our online learning portal, and you'll receive access to a vast number of recordings, including a comprehensive curriculum in tantric philosophy, tantric yoga practices, guided meditations, and much more. Music for the podcast composed and recorded by Ann Leader. Find her at annleader.com. Podcast produced by Paula Chamas. New episodes drop every other week. And may all beings benefit.